Welcome to the second part of today's plenary on climate action. And I am really pleased to have Dr. Emily Shuckburgh with us to answer some rapid fire questions about the climate science and about some of the actions that we can take. Hopefully, some of you have had a chance to look at the update presentation that Emily has shared. It's on demand on the Summit platform. If you haven't, then I would highly recommend it. It is a really fantastic overview of the scale of the challenge, but also some of the really clear ideas for action. So, Emily, welcome back to the A4S Summit.
Oh, it's delightful to join you today, Jessica.
Fantastic. Well, I would like to start whilst everyone gets a chance to post your questions into the chat. So please do throw out anything that you would like to ask Emily. I would like to start with a question that you touched on during your presentation. And in terms of the science and the scale of the challenge, I don't know if there's any sort of headline comment that you would have around that, of something that you think is really important for people to be reflecting on, taking away. I think most people are reasonably aware of the scale of the challenge, but what would those key headlines be?
Well, I think actually the biggest thing, I'll give you one thing to take away, which is that so for a while, it's become obvious that this coming decade is the decade in which we need to take action. And I highlighted in my presentation how we need to halve globally our emissions over this decade if we want to stay on track to get on track to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees of warming. I've actually just been doing a discussion with the BBC World Service, and they were saying, well, is it really the decade of which we need to act, or is this not this coming year, the year in which we need to act, or is that too hyperbolic to say that? And when I was reflecting on that, I thought, well, actually, no, you know what? I think you're right. I think that this coming year is absolutely critical. It's because it sits in that context of the decade in which we need action. But I think that COVID and the response to COVID has given us a new sense of urgency. This is an opportunity for us to really reset our global economies and reset them on a track to set up the economies of the future that we are going to be needing for the coming decades. And unless we take this opportunity right now, this coming year, then we'll have missed the boat.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I woke up to this morning was a report that was, actually really reasonably encouraging in terms of the step forward. So if you look at the commitments that governments have been making around the world to 2050, and this comes back to your point, the road to Glasgow and COP26 next year, you've got more and more governments around the world committing to net zero emissions, mainly by 2050, not necessarily early enough in all cases. But this report was suggesting it translated into 2.1 degrees.
Yes.
So a real step change. I think before it was something like 3.7 if you looked at the commitments that have been made at Paris. So can you share any
in context for you? Yeah, so after Paris, part of Paris, as you'll be aware, countries came forward with their pledges for emissions reductions. And most of those were based around 2030 targets. That was the nationally determined contributions. But if you extrapolated those and worked out roughly what it meant in terms of end of century temperature increase, then you put them together and it was something like 3 degrees or more. So very much not consistent with the other key outcome of the Paris Agreement, which is a commitment to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius of warming, with an ambition to keep them below 1.5 degrees of warming. The announcement that came out this morning from Carbon Action Tracker was that if you take into account the new commitment from China of carbon neutrality by 2060, if you make assumptions that Biden administration, there's been statements that he would like to see the US putting forward an ambition to be net zero by 2050, together with other countries. We're starting to get that 3 degrees nudge down closer to 2 degrees. Still, it's not consistent with the well below 2 degrees of the Paris Agreement, but at least there's movement in the right direction. And on the 12th of December, there's a big conference, which the hope is that more and more countries will come together with their commitments around their new updated nationally determined contributions. And let's hope that we start to get ever so slightly more down towards the sorts of numbers that we need to get to. But as you say, these are long-term commitments, and of themselves, they're not sufficient. We also need to see that near-term action as well.
Yeah. And to that point on near-term action, there are less and less of them, fewer and fewer, but there are still some skeptics out there. So what is the key thing that people can say to skeptics to convince them, or is it not worth it? Is the world changing and they will just have to respond?
Well, listen, I mean, I think we're starting to see the impacts of climate change happening around the world in terms of extreme weather events, whether that's floodings or heat waves or the wildfires that we're seeing right at the moment. I've been seeing all summer in California and starting up again in Australia. That's hard evidence of the sorts of climate change that we're already experiencing, let alone the challenges that we might see in the future. I myself, as you know, have spent much of my career studying the polar regions. So I'm in the privileged position of actually having been to the polar regions and seen for myself the scales of change that are occurring there. Obviously, not everyone is in a position to do that for themselves, but these are not, these are not sort of things that you can take as being true or not. We can start to see these impacts with our own eyes.
Yeah. And in terms of the commitments, you were talking about the next year being a year of action. A lot of people have talked about a decade of action. So certainly from all of the work we do with the business, finance community, I think, and indeed governments, having some really tangible milestones rather than thinking all the way out to 2050. And as you highlight in the video, it's not only net zero by 2050, but it's then carbon negative over the second half of the century. But let's start with the near term. What kind of goals do people need to be setting to be consistent with the science in the near term to give us that hope?
Yeah, well, but I think it's, it's about getting on track for intermediate targets that set you in a good position to actually make those net zero targets on 2050 or ideally before that. And I think that both businesses and investors, but also countries more generally, that means going through every different aspect of your organization and understanding where you can cut those emissions, and I think a lot of organisations, including my own organisation, University of Cambridge, we've started focusing with our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, our direct emissions, and looking to see, for us, a big challenge is how we degasify our estate, and then we're starting to look at, first of all, quantifying, but then looking to see how we can reduce our emissions, our Scope 3 emissions. So that's much more challenging in terms of understanding where our emissions are through our supply chains, through our investments. And that, I think, is where the critical next steps are. And the other thing that I mentioned in the presentation, which I think is the other big issue that's coming up the agenda, is that it's not just about climate. And climate, is incredibly important, but there are other issues that are also starting to get their rightful recognition. The crisis of biodiversity, water, land use, and land degradation, and so forth, are also key issues that are starting to get increased recognition, that we need to account for those as well if we are really to create a sustainable world into the future.
Yeah, and I think that whole point on the need for joined up, interconnected approaches to decisions has really come through strongly. So a few additional questions. So one is, has the horse already bolted? So you've seen, and particularly in the presentation, you touch on some of those tipping points. But so do we need to be thinking about adaptation, building more resilience? Can we do that and reducing emissions at the same time? You also talk about a report around some of the opportunities, which I suspect is where some of the answers to that questions come. So I don't know if you can share a few headlines on some of those themes.
Yeah, so has the horse already bolted? Well, I mean, on the one hand, if we had started as a global society addressing climate change back in the early 1990s, when the first IPCC report came out, then it would have been an awful lot easier to address this problem. But we're not there. So, we've got to deal with the situation where we are. Are we already today seeing the impacts of climate change, and a degree of adaptation to those impacts is required in any case to build resilience? Well, yes, we are. Will we inevitably see more such impacts into the future? Well, our best hope is to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. That's another half degree of warming compared to where we are today. So we will inevitably be seeing more impacts. So we, of course, need to be looking to create more resilience to those climate-related impacts. So we absolutely need to do that. But that's not a question of whether we do that or we reduce our emissions. We have to do both.
Yep. Okay, so we've got 5 more minutes, I think, max. So I'm going to throw a few more questions, see how many we can get through. So if you look at the pandemic year, again, I think I've seen this stat a few times, and you touch on it. The kind of scale of reduction that we need every year is the same as we achieved during parts of this year where the global economy was shut down. So in that rush to get back to normal, to try and refire the economy, how are we going to do that in a way that is consistent with the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, so this is what we've just recently published, a big report on, a blueprint for a green future, looking to see how we can put in place a green recovery. Because as you say, the sorts of emissions reductions that we've seen as a consequence of global shutdowns are the sorts of levels that we need to get year after year after year for the coming decades. So the challenge is really significant. Of course, we want to do that in a planned way rather than an unplanned way, as we saw over the last few months. Now, I think, the opportunity is that some of those behavioural changes that we've been forced into over the last few months, doing more conferences in this virtual format, for example, are ones that will, we can carry forwards into the future, and hopefully that will contribute in some ways to reducing our emissions. But an awful lot more needs to be done in a more structured way. So in looking at how we, as global economies, recover from the current pandemic, we need to be looking to essentially set up an economy that's fit for the future. And that means investing in green jobs. It means investing in green infrastructure, and also building the institutions that are going to be helping to support that. And the really, the fortuitous thing here is there's plenty of evidence now that actually, if you focus on a green recovery, you get a significant multiplier in terms of your investments, in terms of national economies. And so it's actually, not only does it create a better economy that's fit for the future, but it's also actually just makes very good economic sense to be focusing on that.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the different challenges that different economies around the world face, so particularly thinking of the challenges between developed economies and developing economies, very different sets of issues, very different challenges. And also, actually, if you look at the impact from climate, is also often going to hit some of the economies hardest, which are developing. So how do you bridge that gap?
Well, I mean, obviously that's always a really critical part of the international climate negotiations, and we've got coming up next year in Glasgow, the next big COP26, and that sort of issue will be a central part of that. Clearly ensuring that we have the finance flowing in order to help support those countries that will be most impacted by climate change is critically important, as is helping them, those developing countries, to develop in a way that is sustainable, and that means helping support that the implementation of those clean technological solutions that will be required for a clean economy.
Yeah. You are based in Cambridge. And one of the things that Hero touched on was business schools not doing enough to teach climate. I think particularly in the finance and accounting areas, but what more can be done to educate and both current generations of students, but also execs, and kind of really convince them of the need for action and equip them with what they need. And this is the final question we've got time for. So.
Okay, well, but I think that this is also a really, really important question. So I spoke about, green jobs, green infrastructure, green investments, and green infrastructure, but underpinning all of that, not just with regard to our business schools, more generally, we need to be providing people with the skills and training that they're going to require for the jobs of the future to help shape this zero carbon world. And that needs to be done at a country level, but also an international level. So again, when we were talking a moment ago about, what can we do to help support developing countries, some of that also needs to be helping to provide the skills training for those developing countries as well. So I think that, if there's a topic that I think has been much under discussed at an international level, I think it's precisely how do we internationally collaborate to help provide the skills training. And you're absolutely right, or Hero is absolutely right, that ensuring that gets fed through our business schools and our professional development training is also really important.
Fantastic. And that's definitely something that A4S has been focusing on with the communities that we work with. So thank you very much, Emily. It looks like you've got a little visitor just to close the session off. So I think another sign of the year. So really fantastic to have your insights. Thank you for rattling through so many questions. Once again, do watch Emily's presentation and look forward to speaking again soon. Thanks, Emily.
Okay, thank you very much.